You talk about having over 40 lenders.
Mm-hmm.
What's the big advantage to that for those who don't know as a mortgage broker? Why it's an advantage to have such a diversification when it comes to lending capabilities?
So we may have access to 40, really 40 plus when we're taking into account, like Todd mentioned, private lenders. But there's probably 10 that we use regularly and probably 5 that we use every day. It's relationship. It's relationship, it's product, it's rate, and it's service. And not every lender is the same. And I can tell you, we certainly get referrals from the big banks every day because they can't necessarily fit the client in a box, but they think it's a good client. But guess what? We do businesses with the big 5 as well. So some of our biggest lenders are the banks, but it doesn't mean that those are the only lenders that we deal with. And we're experts in doing just one thing. We're experts at mortgage lending. We're experts at really identifying those snowflakes because I think every file is kind of like a snowflake. We look at income, we look at assets, and we look at credit. And there's so many different nuances and just figure out where the best solution for the borrower is really going to be.
Okay, so again, when you've got all these various lenders, some of them are willing to take on risk in a different way. Their rate reflects that. But I would think having some private lenders having the ability to look at a file autonomously and with their own judgment, as opposed to perhaps some of the banks, which is protocol and there's almost a formula lending, I'm sure, right?
Well, but the banks are all federally regulated, so they have to lend within certain guidelines. And then there's alternative lenders, which then still have to lend within guidelines, but they have to justify those guidelines. And then there's credit unions who are provincially regulated. So again, they beat to the sound of their own drum within reason. And private lenders, which could be a mortgage investment corporation, or maybe it's an individual like you and me. And, we're lending out some of our own money for borrowers. Typically, the alternative lenders and the private lenders are more costly because they're taking on files that have a higher risk. But oftentimes, they're for a shorter period of time. They're maybe taking on the risk for 3, 6, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. They're not in business with the borrower forever or for even 25 years like a normal bank lender would be. But when I say bank lenders, I don't necessarily mean the big 5. There are bank lenders, which we consider a monoline lender or a broker-only lender, that they might not have bank branches, but they have a bank license. But maybe the only type of business that they're really doing is mortgage lending. And maybe they're deposit taking as well, but they're not offering like consumer bank accounts. Maybe they only offer maybe investment type products where like GICs or bonds or whatever that they may offer. So we have access to a variety of those lenders, and we can also identify which client and which product is really the best fit. When you walk into a bank or a credit union branch, you can only get what they have, where we can get whatever we think is the best fit for that borrower, and we're doing many transactions. So on a really busy month here in our office, we'll do upwards of 100 transactions. A normal bank branch would only do about 100 transactions a year. So that really just shows the amount of files that we're looking at, and we can figure out what those nuances are and figure out where the best, solution is for the borrower.
When you put together an application to one of the private lenders, and obviously if you're submitting the application, there's some worth. It's worthy of the person's time to look at it. Right?
100%. We only submit a file when we think it'll be approved.
Right.
We don't submit files just to see if they're going to stick. We're not taking spaghetti and throwing it at the wall and seeing if it's going to stick. We only submit files to lenders when we go with the assumption it's being approved.
Do some brokers have that other approach where they'll just send it to everybody?
I can't comment maybe on like what the competition does.
Why not comment on what the competition does?
I think that I think there's a lot of just like submitting it and not knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
We don't do that here. We don't have the time to do that here, to be honest, everyone. Like we are very, very busy, but it's the expertise and it's better for the client because, if it's a quick no, it's usually a quick no for something that we don't know. So maybe there's something on the credit bureau that we don't see. Some lenders, like we use Equifax here in our office, but some lenders will use Equifax and TransUnion. So maybe there's something on TransUnion that we don't see. I don't know. There could also be maybe some negative history with that lender for the borrower and we didn't know that. So it was only available maybe on their internal system and it didn't show up on the credit bureau. So we weren't able to identify those issues. And then sometimes there can be issues that pop up kind of after the fact. Maybe there's issues with the property. Maybe it's not that marketable. Maybe the file is somewhat marginal and we really believe that we could sell it to the lender, but it wasn't within their appetite. It happens. Mm-hmm. But I think that we are really good at providing that feedback to the clients. They know exactly where their situation is. They aren't just like sitting and waiting and hoping and dreaming and, saying a prayer that their mortgage is going to be approved. We communicate with them. And if there is an issue, we're telling them. And then we can always make a plan. Every borrower in Canada can get a mortgage. I've said this before. But if your income isn't quite there, maybe it's stated income, maybe you're self-employed, then maybe we have to use an alternative lender. Maybe your credit's not that good. Maybe we need to use an alternative lender or a private lender. But if we have to use an alternative or a private lender, maybe you need 20% down or 25% down or 35% down or 50% down. And the challenge is, in more rural areas, not every alternative lender lends there. That's just reality. Not every lender in Canada lends even in Nova Scotia. We are a small market compared to markets like Ontario and BC. But guess what? We are getting noticed. I can tell you there's some lenders that we are the only brokerage that has access to these lenders. We are basically doing pilot projects for these lenders in this market. Mm-hmm. So coming to a brokerage like ours, we are small. We don't have 40 or 50 mortgage brokers. We don't. There are 4 of us that see clients, but we have a great amount of support. We have fulfillment advisors and we have customer service advisors that answer the phone every day. And, I still do mortgage lending. Some people call or email and they just assume that I just do like radio and TV and, write books and posts and emails and stuff like that. I actually see clients full time. And I think that's what's really, really important, because I may have a great team of people, but I'm also in the thick of things with them. I'm in the trenches. So I can see those trends and I can certainly provide that feedback and that advice.
What's your ratio of, not success might not be there, but of approval of things that you submit that get approved across the board? I'm sure you've got that metric.
I have a very high approval rating. I actually have the highest approval rating in the office, but that's based on experience. I've been doing this for 15 years in the same industry, same lenders. I have very, very entrenched relationships, but also I don't try to do every file. I know what I'm really good at. We still offer all kinds of different financing, like you talked about private lending and alternative lending. I typically don't do those files myself because I'm not an expert at those files. But we have a couple people in the office that really, that's their bread and butter. And maybe I'll start the file, or maybe I'll get going on a file and I'll identify that, this actually needs an alternative lender. Mm-hmm. And I'll work with the team in the office to do it. But the reason that I'm really focusing on, purchases, refinances, and renewals is because I don't want to be everything to everybody. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not offering it in the office. But I want to be the ultimate expert at a very few things. And I think we're in that position. It's the same thing when people, talk about side hustles and all these things. Mm-hmm. I think that you should be the best at what you're doing and go all in. And I can tell you, I'm all in on mortgage lending. We wouldn't be here and being on the radio on Saturdays and Sundays and on Tuesdays and doing these type of things if we didn't want to educate consumers. And Todd, I don't think you would be here either. You know what I mean? And I'm probably sure that after all these years, you never thought you'd know so much about mortgage lending.
I think I know more about mortgage lending than the average person.
I will 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
And, I hope our listeners that are listening know more than consumers that are just walking on the street. And I really pride myself on that. I think that we provide lots of great information. And, we're going to continue.
Can you tell when people come into your office and they sit across from you what their level of first of all, their interest is and what their level of knowledge is pretty quickly?
Oh, yeah. I definitely know kind of how savvy they are. And obviously, we get more into certain things with people that are maybe the first-time home buyers versus repeat. Today, I had a first-time home buyer sitting in my office to sign their mortgage documents, and I had an existing client from 10 years ago coming in to sign their mortgage documents. Very, very different conversations. Really, the first-time home buyer, it was conversations around affordability and making sure they can afford it, and things like mortgage insurance and how does a property tax account work and when do the property taxes come out. But the existing client, we were talking about how can we pay down your mortgage faster? What will we do on your next renewal? Strategy, things like that. It's very, very different conversations, but that's why I think it's so important to use an unbiased mortgage professional, because really it's about the relationship.
We haven't talked about cottages yet. We've teed it up all twice now, and we've not talked about it yet. So we have to talk about
We
cottages.
will talk about cottages, and I promise you we will talk about refinance.
Okay, cottages, refinance, that, and perhaps a few other things. Mortgage 101, Clinton Wilkins and myself, Todd Veinotte, returns right after this.